The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn as Laura Bennett moved through the ICU corridors of Seattle General, her movements economical and precise, each step calculated like a soldier crossing hostile terrain. She didn't need to speak to be present. Her hands did the talking, steady on the blood pressure cuff in room 347, checking vitals with a kind of attention that made patients feel seen rather than merely processed. Colonel Vance, still weak from his post-operative recovery, had asked for her twice that morning. She'd arrived without comment and taken his blood pressure like she was reading the most important data in the world, because to her, she was. The scrubs hung loose on her frame, deliberately oversized, and when she turned to adjust the fall line, the fluorescent lights caught something else, a faded patch of fabric sewn inside her jacket lining as she removed it at the nurse's station. Her hands moved to cover it in one fluid motion, muscle memory that nobody seemed to notice. The patch bore a symbol, worn and discolored from years of being hidden, from a time when wearing it openly would have meant something very different. She folded the jacket carefully and placed it on the shelf beneath her locker, making sure the patch disappeared completely from view. A slight limp favored her left leg today, the older injury, the one that ached when the barometric pressure dropped. She'd learned long ago not to mention it. Complaints invited questions, and questions required answers she couldn't give. Dr. Marcus Pierce, chief of surgery at Seattle General for the past 8 years, had a habit of appearing in hallway shadows at precisely the moment someone was doing something worth observing. He'd been there yesterday when a patient's family member, a woman who'd been terrified about her husband's upcoming procedure, had gripped Laura's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for explaining everything. You made me feel like someone actually cares." He'd watched Laura nod once, quickly, and disappear back into the clinical routine. The gratitude in that voice had seemed to bother him more than anything else could. Today he stood at the nurse's station with her personnel file open in front of him, his reading glasses perched on his nose like a judge studying evidence of a crime. His fingers drummed once against the paper, tap, tap, a gesture of minor irritation that had become familiar to everyone on the unit. Where did Bennett work before this? His voice was precisely pitched to carry without seeming to shout, a technique he'd perfected over thousands of rounds. Not a question asked of Laura directly, but asked in her vicinity, meant for her to overhear and internally correct herself. The charge nurse, Maria, glanced up from the computer. "Some military hospital, I think. She doesn't really talk about it." "Military." Dr. Pierce removed his glasses and folded them slowly, deliberately. "Which branch?" "She doesn't say." Maria had learned not to elaborate. Laura's reticence was contagious, nobody asked follow-up questions anymore. Dr. Pierce closed the file with a sound like a snap, authoritative and final. "Interesting. No advanced credentials, no residency in a major trauma center, and yet somehow every patient she touches seems to recover faster than the standard protocol suggests they should." He smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. Almost like she's somehow exceptional beyond her pay grade. The words were designed to sound complimentary. They were not. They were designed to plant a seed in Maria's mind, a small suggestion that something was wrong with this picture, that someone without proper credentials should not be performing at an elite level. Competence without credentials looked like fraud. Laura walked past the nurse's station at that moment, her radio clipped to her belt in a way that seemed military to anyone who paid attention, positioned for quick access, secured with practiced efficiency. She didn't acknowledge Dr. Pierce. She never did. She simply continued toward room 347, where the morning rounds were beginning, and the theater of institutional hierarchy would play out as it always did. Dr. Pierce followed her. He always did during rounds. His presence had become like weather, constant and inescapable. In room 312, where a 64-year-old man lay recovering from a complex spinal fusion, Dr. Pierce began to speak. His voice was measured, concerned, the careful tone of a physician who was deeply worried about patient safety. "Mr. Harrison, how are you feeling this morning? Any concerns about your post-operative care?" Mr. Harrison, still slightly groggy from pain medication, shook his head. "Fine. Your nurse has been excellent. She checked on me 4 times last night, even though I only pressed the call button twice." 4 times, Dr. Pierce repeated thoughtfully. He turned to Laura, who was adjusting the patient's flow rate with calibrated precision. "Nurse Bennett, that seems excessive. Were there specific medical concerns warranting that level of monitoring?" Laura's jaw tightened for exactly 1 beat, imperceptible to most observers, completely clear to anyone trained to recognize restraint. Patient was showing early signs of postoperative delirium at 2 a.m. Blood pressure elevated by 18 points. Breathing pattern shallow. I monitored vitals every 45 minutes until stabilization. The medical terminology was perfect. The procedure was textbook. The documentation would be flawless because Laura's documentation always was. But Dr. Pierce was already turning back to Mr. Harrison with an expression of paternal concern. "You see, this is what I mean about experience levels," he said softly, as if sharing a confidence. "A more experienced nurse would likely have simply given you a sedative and called it resolved. Our nurse Bennett is perhaps a bit overzealous, well-meaning, certainly, but sometimes excessive caution can be its own form of harm. Too much intervention." Mr. Harrison's face shifted. Doubt flickered across his features, visible as a shadow. "Seed planted." Laura said nothing. She continued checking vitals, her hands as steady as a laser being guided by someone who had held other people's lives in these exact hands in conditions far worse than a hospital room in Savannah, Georgia. She didn't correct him. She didn't defend herself. She simply maintained her composure the way she'd been trained to maintain it, not as a nurse, but as something else entirely, something that had no official title and required no credentials. Dr. Pierce moved through the rest of the rounds with this rhythm established. In room 319, discussing a patient with multiple comorbidities, he caught the attention of the patient's daughter and smiled warmly. "Your mother is in excellent hands with our entire team. Though I should mention, I personally review all complex cases for safety protocols. Sometimes nurses, particularly newer ones, can miss the subtle indicators that separate adequate care from exceptional care." The daughter's protective instinct activated immediately. She looked at Laura with sudden uncertainty. In the break room at 2 p.m., something shifted in the atmosphere the moment Laura sat down with her lunch. The 7 staff members who'd been laughing moments before seemed to suddenly remember urgent tasks elsewhere, charting that couldn't wait, patient calls that required immediate attention, supplies that needed restocking. Within 90 seconds, the room was empty except for the hum of the refrigerator and the mechanical breathing of the vending machine. Laura opened her container of grilled chicken and rice, ate methodically, and didn't look up. She'd been at Seattle General for exactly 4 months. The requests for her assignment had started in week 2, family members specifically asking if Nurse Bennett would be taking their loved one's case. The complaints from other nurses had started in week 3, nothing overt, nothing actionable, just a general sense that something about her presence made people feel inadequate. The shift in how staff interacted with her had solidified by week 6. Dr. Pierce had done this work deliberately. She recognized the pattern because she'd seen institutional cultures destroyed before. Not by one dramatic action, but by the patient application of doubt, spread like a slow infection through the organizational bloodstream. One conversation at a time. One suggestion at a time. One smile at a time. What happened next didn't just change the temperature on the unit, it changed everything. Laura's radio crackled at 2:33 p.m., just as she was finishing her charting. Not the usual call from nursing desk. A different frequency. A voice she hadn't heard in 8 months, one that made her hand still on the keyboard for exactly 2 seconds before she responded. "This is Bennett. Captain Bennett, I need your assistance with a patient admission." The caller was Dr. Sarah Chen from the VA coordinator's office, speaking with the kind of deliberate formality that meant everything had been arranged. Everything was official. "Colonel James Vance, admitted yesterday, post-operative status. He's requested you specifically for his care continuity. The assignment is already in the system." Laura's breathing remained level. Her eyes, however, shifted to the window of room 347, where the old soldier was sleeping between monitoring checks. Colonel Vance, who had commanded her son Marcus at Bagram, who had written the letter that came to her address 3 years ago, the one that explained in perfect military syntax why her boy had volunteered for the unit in the first place, why he needed his mother to know he was proud. "Understood," Laura said. "I'll take the assignment." She didn't know that Dr. Pierce, standing 3 corridors away speaking to the hospital administrator about quarterly surgical outcomes, would see that assignment notification the moment it populated in the system. She didn't know that he would recognize the name Colonel Vance, the distinguished patient in room 347, and the suddenly very specific attention from the VA coordinator. She didn't know that his competitive instinct would activate in that moment, the sense that something was happening that he didn't control, something that bypassed his authority. But the war for room 347, and everything it represented, had already begun. The warning appeared on the unit board Friday morning, centered between the shift rotation schedule and a thank you card from a discharged patient. Laura saw it the same way everyone else did, pinned at eye level in the break room where staff clustered with their coffee, where it would be read and reread and discussed in hushed tones for the next 72 hours. Disciplinary notice, Del Bennett, failure to communicate critical patient changes, case number 4782. The irony sat heavy in her chest, the kind of weight that didn't show on her face. She'd charted everything for Colonel Vance. Every drain output timestamped. Every vitals entry co-signed. Every medication administration documented with precision that would satisfy a Pentagon audit. The case Dr. Pierce referenced didn't exist as he'd described it. But that was the point, wasn't it? The specificity of the lie made it harder to fight than a vague accusation. Numbers. Case numbers. Official letterhead. The architecture of institutional authority. Laura read it once, her hand still wrapped around her coffee mug, steam rising past her chin. 2 nurses stood 3 feet away, pretending not to watch her reaction. One of them whispered something. The other's laugh came sharp and quick. Laura's knuckles whitened on the mug for exactly 2 seconds, then relaxed. She set the coffee down on the bulletin board shelf, turned, and walked back to her rounds. The trembling that rose in her hand she forced still by the time she reached the stairwell, channeling it into a measured breath that came out steady as a baseline. By that afternoon, Dr. Pierce was on the phone. She didn't know this part, not yet. She was in room 312 adjusting an 4-drip when his voice carried through the hallway, smooth and measured, the tone he used with families and surgeons, the voice that sounded like concern even when it was calculated. His office door was closed, but the hospital walls were thin, and sound traveled through the ventilation like gossip through a small town. 3 phone calls. She would only know about them later, but the mechanics of institutional destruction moved with predictable precision. First was the board member with the Regional Surgical Society, a man named Hendricks who'd written a paper Pierce had cited favorably at a conference 6 years ago. Second was the hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Whitmore, who listened to Pierce's concerns about patient safety with the weariness of someone who'd been lobbied by ambitious surgeons before. Third was the state nursing board. Laura knew none of this as she checked the 4-rate, as she asked Colonel Vance how his pain was rated on the 1 to 10 scale, as she documented everything with the same meticulous care she'd used for 3 years. The documentation that would later be called incomplete. The care that would be reframed as careless. But something had changed in the air of Seattle General, a subtle shift in pressure and temperature that people in closed systems learn to recognize. The kind of shift that precedes a storm. The break room became a minefield. Monday lunchtime, Laura sat in the corner chair with a sandwich wrapped in plastic and a worn paperback she'd been reading for 2 weeks, the same 3 pages, because concentration required a kind of peace she no longer had access to during her shifts. The book was a distraction technique only. 3 nurses entered through the double doors, their conversation animated and bright, the kind of mood that collapsed the instant they saw her. One of them, Rodriguez, who'd smiled at her exactly once in the past 3 weeks, stopped mid-laugh. The other 2 followed her gaze. There was a moment of dead air, the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical song overhead, the vending machine in the corner emitting its faint electrical whine. "Oh," Rodriguez said, her face rearranging itself into an expression of remembered urgency. "I need to make some calls." The second nurse, Keisha, was already moving toward the door. "Yeah, I forgot I had to call my mom before 3. The third one grabbed her lunch container from the refrigerator without bothering with an excuse. Gone. All three of them, in the space of 90 seconds, evaporating like water on hot tile. Laura sat with her plastic-wrapped sandwich, the pages of her book open to a scene she wouldn't remember reading, and listened to the vending machine hum its lonely frequency. The isolation wasn't subtle. It was weaponized. It was chosen. She ate half the sandwich anyway, each bite requiring a conscious decision to swallow. The food tasted like cardboard and resignation. She forced it down because skipping meals was a choice that showed, a tell that people could use as evidence that she was struggling, and struggling meant vulnerable, and vulnerable meant Dr. Pierce had already won the narrative. Pain was information. She'd learned that in Bagram, in contexts she could never reference in a break room at Seattle General. Pain told you where the injury was. But this kind of pain, the social kind, the institutional kind, had a different data signature. It told you that the machinery of the hospital was moving against you in coordinated fashion. That the warning on the bulletin board wasn't an isolated incident but the first domino in a sequence someone was engineering. She finished her lunch alone. Stayed until 1:19 p.m., 5 minutes longer than necessary, because leaving early would look like defeat. Then she walked back to the unit and resumed her rounds, her face betraying nothing, her hand steady on every blood pressure cuff and fall line. Tuesday morning, the state nursing board had received a complaint. Dr. Pierce's call had been perfectly calibrated. He'd cited the disciplinary notice on file. He'd mentioned his concerns about pattern behavioral issues. He'd been deeply, performatively reluctant, the kind of reluctant that doctors perfected, where they made it sound like they were being forced into accountability by the weight of their own conscience. The complaint was vague enough to require investigation but specific enough to sound credible. A formal inquiry would take weeks. During those weeks, the narrative would solidify. Laura showed up for her shifts. She moved through the hospital like someone walking through water, each moment requiring an increment more effort than it should. The other nurses watched her with expressions that ranged from pity to satisfaction. Dr. Pierce nodded at her with the kind of cordial distance he used for anyone beneath his notice. Colonel Vance's post-op recovery continued, perfect vital signs, drain outputs improving, healing on schedule. But the political infection spreading through the unit's ecosystem was a different kind of crisis, one that no medication could treat. She thought about her son Marcus, about the reason she was in Savannah in the first place, about the night 3 years ago when she'd received a phone call from a number that wasn't listed anywhere in any directory. A Pentagon handler's voice, professional and final, Captain Laura Bennett no longer exists on paper. Your service record is classified at the highest level. Your deployment photos are expunged. Your unit's operations in Bagram, all of it sealed. For security purposes. For operational security. For reasons that would never be explained to anyone including her. She died, in a bureaucratic sense, the night she'd signed the non-disclosure agreement in a basement office at Joint Base Lewis McChord. 3 years later, she was working as a nurse called less experienced, being isolated in break rooms, watching an ambitious surgeon systematically dismantle her credibility because she was competent in a way he couldn't control. Thursday evening, the charge nurse pulled her aside during shift change. Jennifer, older, tired, someone who'd worked at Seattle General for 17 years and had developed the institutional survival instinct of someone who understood which battles destroyed you. They're going to push harder, Jennifer said quietly, her voice low enough that the other nurses couldn't hear. Whatever you did, or Pierce thinks you did, he's committed now. This doesn't end with a warning. Laura nodded once. I understand. Do you? Jennifer's eyes searched her face. Because you have options. You can transfer units. You can request a different hospital. You can. I'm staying in room 347. Jennifer's jaw tightened. She was quiet for a long moment. Then you better be very, very careful. Because whatever he's planning, it's not going to be small. Friday afternoon, Dr. Pierce was in the physician's lounge when the phone rang. The hospital administrator. The state nursing board had escalated his complaint. A formal investigation was opening. An inspector would be calling within 5 business days. Pierce smiled, set the phone down, and poured himself a coffee that he drank while watching the unit through the lounge window. He could see Laura moving from room to room, her movements precise, her focus absolute. She was checking on Colonel Vance, adjusting his medications, asking the kinds of quiet questions that patients actually answered truthfully because they trusted her. He'd have that trust destroyed before the week ended. The machinery was in motion now. 3 phone calls had activated a network of institutional obligation. A written warning had created a paper trail. A complaint to the State Board had introduced government scrutiny. The combination of these elements moved with the inexorable force of a system designed to protect itself, to protect those who understood how to operate within its power structures, and to eliminate those who somehow achieved respect without authorization. Dr. Pierce didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He understood something that Laura Bennett, with all her military training, all her medals locked in a closet, all her discipline and composure, couldn't access while she was still pretending to be just a nurse. Power moved through channels. And he'd just activated every one of them. The doors to Seattle General's 3rd floor burst open at 2:06 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the sound that followed, a man's voice like a diesel engine at full throttle, made every nurse within earshot go rigid. Dale Kruger was 250 pounds, a former bouncer, the kind of bulk that came from steroids and rage rather than discipline, and he was screaming about custody and visitation rights as he shoved past the desk clerk hard enough to send her backward into the registration counter. His face was crimson, veins standing out on his neck like they might split the skin, and he didn't care that this was a hospital, that people were trying to heal here, that the fluorescent lights above hummed with the ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday afternoon that was about to become extraordinary. "Where is he?" Dale roared, his voice carrying down the hallway with the weight of pure animal aggression. "Where's that military bastard?" "Vance! I know you're up here." He was looking for Colonel Marcus Vance, the commanding officer who had written the letter that kept Marcus Bennett stateside, who had understood, in the way only combat soldiers understand, that some mothers carried secrets too heavy to name. Vance was in room 347, 3 days post-op from a routine hernia repair, still weak from anesthesia, with surgical drain tubes running from his abdomen to collection bulbs. He had no idea that his ex-wife's new boyfriend was about to walk through his door like a storm surge. Laura heard the commotion from the medication dispensary, where she'd been pulling post-op antibiotics for her 4 p.m. rounds. The sound of a man in rage is distinct. It's not a shout, it's a frequency that triggers something primal in the nervous system, a warning bell that rings in the brainstem before conscious thought even registers. She set the medication tray down with deliberate slowness, her movements economical and precise, and walked toward room 347 with the measured stride of someone who had learned long ago that urgency moves faster than panic. Dale had already kicked the door open. The wood splintered around the deadbolt, and the sound of it cracking against the inside wall echoed into the hallway like a gunshot. Vance tried to sit up in bed, confusion flashing across his face. Old soldiers recognize danger, but they also recognize that hospitals are supposed to be safe, and the cognitive dissonance took him a half-second too long to process. "You kept my kid from me," Dale was screaming, moving toward the bed with the momentum of someone who had spent his life solving problems with his fists. "Military scum, poisoning her against me." His hands reached for Colonel Vance's midsection, and his fingers closed around the surgical drain tubes. He pulled. The sound was small, a wet sound, almost organic, like fabric tearing, and Vance's face went white. Not from pain yet, but from recognition. Those tubes were holding his surgical site stable. The drains were staying in because they needed to stay in. And this man had just compromised something that was supposed to heal. Laura crossed the threshold of room 347 in 3 strides. She didn't announce herself. She didn't say, "Security," or "Sir, you need to step back." Her right hand came up to intercept Dale's follow-up swing, a backhanded motion that carried the full weight of his body, the momentum of a man used to winning fights with a single blow. Her forearm caught his wrist, and she let his force flow through her like water through a pipe, redirecting it downward and across her body. Her lip split against her teeth as contact registered, the taste of copper, sharp and immediate. The impact was hard enough that her vision flickered white for a fraction of a second. But she didn't go down. She didn't stumble backward. She didn't make a sound. Dale's mistake was assuming she would. His second punch came faster, a left hook meant to follow the trajectory of the backhand, meant to punish her for daring to get in his way. Laura caught it at the wrist and elbow, her muscle memory from 12 years of combatives training rising like something ancient and efficient. Her body had been trained once upon a time by men whose names she could no longer say aloud, in places that didn't exist on maps, for situations that were supposed to stay classified until the end of the world. This was not that situation. This was a man in a hospital room, and her patient was hemorrhaging into his abdomen because a monster had torn his drains loose. She pivoted on her left foot, twisted his arm into a standing arm bar, his elbow hyperextended, his shoulder torque-locked, his body trapped in a geometry of pain, and used his own momentum to drive him forward. His face met the linoleum tile first, then his chest, his arms pinned beneath him as she planted her left knee between his shoulder blades and kept the armbar tight enough that he couldn't move without breaking his own arm. He stopped moving. The hallway was silent. Not the quiet of a normal Tuesday afternoon, but the thick silence that comes when the laws of the physical world have just been demonstrated to someone who thought he lived outside them. A nurse with blood on her lip and a 250-pound former bouncer pinned to the floor like someone had hit a pause button on reality. Security arrived at a run, their radios crackling with static and urgency. 2 officers, then 3, slowing as they processed the scene, the man on the ground, the quiet nurse with blood running down her chin, the room that smelled now like fear sweat and antiseptic and the particular scent of disrupted surgical sites. "I've got him," Laura said. Her voice was level, almost conversational. She didn't sound like someone who had just fought a man twice her size. She sounded like someone who had done this before, which she had, but that was a life she didn't have anymore. Security took over. They cuffed Dale, who was now conscious enough to realize what had happened but not conscious enough to be angry about it yet. That would come later, in the police station, when his pride would start burning worse than his hyperextended arm. As they led him away, Laura turned back to Colonel Vance, her jaw set, her mind already calculating. "How much blood?" she asked him quietly. "I don't know," Vance said. His voice was shaky, and there was pain in his eyes now, the delayed reaction of trauma. "I felt him pull." "Can you move your legs?" "Both sides?" "Yes." "Any numbness?" "Tingling." She was running through the diagnostic criteria, assessing for spinal injury, internal bleeding, nerve damage. The drain tubes were designed to prevent fluid accumulation in the surgical cavity, but Dale's pull had been violent, unpredictable. She needed imaging. She needed to know what had been torn inside, what was leaking where. She was so focused on Colonel Vance that she almost didn't notice Dr. Pierce appearing in the doorway, his face registering the scene with the speed of a politician reading a room, the broken door, the blood, the implicit narrative of chaos. He met her eyes across the distance of 6 feet and 10 inches of tile floor. Something shifted in his expression. Not concern. Not professional curiosity. A kind of satisfaction, like someone who had just watched a piece fall into place on a chessboard they'd been planning for weeks. But that wasn't the worst part. 20 minutes later, after Laura had called for an emergency transfer to imaging, after Colonel Vance had been wheeled out of his room to get a CT scan that would show exactly what Dale Kruger had damaged, after the floor had returned to something resembling normal operations, Vance's vitals started to tell a different story. His heart rate climbed from 88 to 110 in the minutes after his return from radiology. By the time he was back in room 347, his oxygen saturation was dropping like an elevator with cut cables, from 98% to 94 to 91 to 88. His neck vein started to distend. Laura was at the medication cart when the monitor alarm triggered. She recognized the pattern immediately: tachycardia, hypoxia, neck vein distension. The trinity of tension pneumothorax. The CT scan had cleared his lungs visually, but the assault, the yanking of the drains, the internal disruption had caused something worse than bleeding. Air was leaking into his chest cavity, compressing his lungs, pushing against his heart, collapsing the very mechanism that kept him alive. Every breath he took was making it worse, not better. The pressure was building like a bomb, and the only thing that would stop it was a needle pushed into the space between his ribs at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, releasing the pressure in 2 quick bursts of escaping air. She was moving toward his room before the alarm finished its first cycle. Behind her, she heard the call going out over the intercom, code, room 347. Code, room 347 inch, and the response team was already running. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Pain is information, and the information she had was that a man was dying in real time, and the only thing between Colonel Vance and cardiac arrest was 70 seconds and a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Dr. Pierce arrived at the same moment she did. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority, the assumption that everyone around him would fall into line because he had already decided the shape the world should take. "Tension pneumothorax," Laura said, her voice moving lower in her register, the quality shifting into something that carried a different kind of certainty. "He needs needle decompression now. Second intercostal, midclavicular line." "We'll wait for imaging," Pierce said. He stepped sideways, placing himself between Laura and the crash cart with the deliberate posture of someone protecting territory. "Get a chest X-ray. Get a proper diagnosis." Vance's oxygen saturation was 82 now, and his lips were losing color. Not pale. Blue. The color of oxygenated blood leaving the system, the color of a man drowning in air. "Sir," Laura said, and her voice had changed again. It was no longer requesting permission. It was delivering information. "He'll arrest before imaging. He needs the needle now. Right now." Pierce turned to face her fully, and there was something in his expression that wasn't just anger. It was the look of a man who had found what he was looking for, a moment where Laura Bennett would either break protocol and prove herself the insubordinate problem he'd been documenting, or she would stand down and let a man die to protect her job. It was a trap constructed from institutional authority and the mathematics of fear. "You're already on notice," Pierce said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "You're already under investigation. You touch that equipment and you're done here. Finished. No references. No appeals. Done." Laura looked at Colonel Vance. She looked at his blue lips. She looked at the man who had sent her son home alive when others had come back in boxes. She looked at the surgical drain tubes that Dale Kruger had torn from his abdomen, disrupting the careful healing that everyone in this room was supposed to be protecting. She reached for the 14-gauge decompression needle. Pierce grabbed her wrist. "Security," he shouted, not taking his eyes off her. "Security to 347. But Dr. Richard Chen, an ER attending who had heard the code call and recognized the vital sign pattern from Vance's monitor output, was already moving. He pushed past both of them, already assembling the equipment, already moving through the muscle memory of 1,000 codes. His hand came up with the needle, his eyes finding the anatomical landmarks on Vance's chest, his movements precise and economical as someone who had practiced this 10,000 times in his mind. The needle went in. The sound was distinct, a small hiss, like air escaping from a tire, and then another hiss as the one-way valve released the pressure that had been building in Vance's chest cavity. His oxygen saturation climbed. 92, 94. 96, his heart rate normalized. The blue drained from his lips, replaced by the pink of actual oxygenation. He gasped. Not a sound of pain or fear, but the fundamental relief of a body that could breathe again. Dr. Pierce was already on his phone. His face was the color of someone who had just watched a plan collapse, but his mind was already moving to contingency. To escalation. To the fact that he had witnesses, multiple staff members who had heard the exchange, who had heard Laura challenge his authority, who had heard him invoke her probationary status as leverage. "I need to speak to hospital administration," he said into the phone, his voice steady, professional, the voice of a concerned physician reporting a patient safety concern. "We have a nursing staff member who physically assaulted a physician during a code. She also has a documented pattern of insubordination and appears to have a history of violence. I'm concerned about her access to patients." By the end of shift, Laura was escorted by 2 security officers to the Human Resources Department on the first floor. The walk down the hallway felt like moving through water. She could hear the buzz of conversation stopping as she passed, the way people's eyes tracked her, the way her presence had transformed from invisible to visible in the worst possible way. By Friday morning, her badge was being processed out of the system. 3 board members that Dr. Pierce had called personally were already demanding her termination. When the administrator asked about her previous employment, Laura sat in a grey plastic chair under fluorescent lights and said the only thing she could say, "I can't discuss my previous work." The words sounded like guilt. The words that came next didn't sound like truth. They sounded like confession. "I can't discuss my previous employment." Laura sat in the grey plastic chair, fluorescent tubes overhead casting everything in institutional white. The hospital administrator stared at her across the laminate table like she'd just admitted to fraud. The silence stretched, and in that silence, she understood, her refusal to explain would be interpreted as guilt. There was no way to tell him the truth without violating the last instruction a Pentagon handler had given her 3 years ago, standing in a rain-soaked parking lot at Joint Base Lewis McChord. Captain Laura Bennett no longer exists on paper. That was the deal. That was the price of staying alive. Dr. Pierce had already made his move. 40 minutes after Dale Kruger's body had hit the linoleum, after security had cuffed him, after Colonel Vance had been stabilized, after Laura had simply returned to her rounds without a word, Pierce had locked himself in his office and made 3 phone calls. The first was to the hospital's chief of staff. The second was to a board member who owed him a favor from a real estate deal in 2019. The third was to the number listed under Laura Bennett's professional references, a trauma surgery fellowship at Walter Reed Medical Center, 2015 to 2017. The number was disconnected. When he called back, an automated voice explained that this number was no longer in service. He tried the second reference, a deployment with the Army Medical Corps, Bagram Airfield, 2018 to 2019. The line rang 6 times. A woman answered with a bureaucratic monotone, "This is the Pentagon Records Office. How may I direct your call?" Pierce explained he was verifying employment history. There was a pause. A very long pause. Then, "We have no record of that individual or those dates. I'm unable to provide further information." The line went dead. That should have been his first warning. That should have been the moment he realized he was reaching for something that had been deliberately buried. Instead, it confirmed everything he needed to believe, that Laura Bennett was a liar, that her credentials were fabricated, that the board needed to act immediately and decisively. He called an emergency meeting for 4 p.m. The administrator had reluctantly agreed, sensing institutional liability but not yet understanding its shape. Now Laura sat across from him, and the administrator's face was a study in cognitive dissonance. On one side of the scale, a quiet nurse with impeccable clinical work and inexplicable references. On the other side, a woman who'd just systematically dismantled a 250-pound man with the efficiency of someone who'd done it before, whose listed employment history had turned to smoke when anyone tried to verify it, whose background check had raised flags high enough to require a Pentagon callback. "Captain Bennett," the administrator said, and Laura's stomach dropped at the title. Someone had dug deeper than Pierce. "Your background check is unusual. Your previous employer, if there was one, seems to have no record of you. That's not normal. That's not even possible, unless someone went to extraordinary lengths to make you disappear from official documentation. So I need to ask you directly, who are you? And what's the truth?" Laura's hands rested on the table, steady as surgical steel. Around her, the fluorescent lights hummed their electric monotone. She could feel the weight of the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, hanging in the locker outside, 2 inches of faded tan fabric with a call sign stitched in thread so worn it was barely legible. Nighthawk 6. That was her truth. That was also impossible to say. "I can't discuss my previous employment," she said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. "There are security restrictions. Classification restrictions. If I talk about where I worked or what I did, it becomes a problem for more people than just me." The administrator leaned back. Dr. Pierce smiled, a small, satisfied smile that said, "There it is. She's hiding something. She's dangerous." "That's not an answer," the administrator said, not unkindly. "That's a wall. And hospitals don't have room for walls. We need transparency. We need accountability. We need to know who we're employing in our trauma units." He gestured toward the door, where security was already waiting. They'd been staged there since the assault, just in case this meeting went badly. "I'm going to have to suspend your privileges pending a full state investigation. You can't practice at Seattle General until your background is cleared. Which, based on what we're seeing, might be impossible." Pierce had already drafted the termination letter. Laura had seen it in the administrator's hand when she walked into this room, her name printed on official letterhead, the language perfectly calibrated to protect the hospital from liability while destroying any chance she'd find work at another facility. Gross misconduct. Dangerous judgment. Physical assault on a patient. They were reframing the Dale Kruger incident, pivoting from justified defense to reckless violence. The narrative was already hardening, already spreading through the hospital's unofficial channels. By tomorrow, she'd be the violent ex-military nurse who'd attacked a family member in front of witnesses. She stood. No one had told her she could. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll gather my things." The rain started as she walked toward the employee exit, and it didn't stop. Her shift had ended at 6 p.m. By 6:51, she was carrying a cardboard box out of the locker room, everything she'd accumulated in 18 months of work reduced to small, disposable items. A cracked coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. A half-dead succulent that had been a gift from Colonel Vance's wife 3 weeks ago, before everything fractured. And a photograph, the only one she'd kept, from Bagram in 2019. 12 people in front of a concrete barrier, faces weathered by dust and deployment. Her hands were on the shoulders of a younger Marcus, who'd been 17 and visiting on emergency leave. His commanding officer stood beside her, already looking like someone who'd seen too much. "Colonel Vance, with that particular exhaustion that only came from knowing you'd outlived people you were supposed to protect." The faces of the other 10 soldiers she could never name aloud. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a tragedy. Her jacket was soaked through, water seeping past the outer fabric to that faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the only piece of her identity the hospital hadn't been able to strip away, because it existed in a space they didn't know to look. She reached into the cardboard box and touched the photograph, fingertips tracing the edge of Marcus's young face. He was 18 now, in basic training, following a path she'd hoped he'd avoid but also understood he couldn't. Some things were in the blood. Some things were inherited like scar tissue. The bus stop was 2 blocks away, a small shelter with broken plexiglass and a bench wet enough that she'd have to sit on the cardboard box. The last bus to her apartment came at 7:23. She had 31 minutes to exist in this small pocket of public space, a woman with a box and a cracked mug and a photograph of people who no longer existed officially, who existed only in the classified files of a Pentagon that had decided their operation never happened. That was when the beat-up Honda pulled to the curb. The engine was loud, the muffler hanging on by what looked like prayer and duct tape. The driver's side door opened and Marcus stepped out, 18 years old in army fatigues that didn't quite fit yet, his face flushed with the particular anger that only a young soldier could muster. He was holding a showbox in both hands like it contained something that might shatter. "Mom, they need to see these," he said, and Laura's entire body went still. "They need to know what you did." "No." The word came out as a command, the kind of thing that made subordinates straighten their spines. "Marcus, no. Get back in the car. Colonel Vance told me everything." Marcus's voice cracked on the last word, and she saw her own eyes in his face, the same color, the same particular geometry of grief and stubbornness. "You saved his life at Bagram. You saved 5 other soldiers. You were bleeding out and you still did the triage. You still held them together. And they fired you for saving his life again." Laura moved faster than she'd moved in 3 years, the limp in her left leg suddenly irrelevant, muscle memory overriding the deterioration of civilian life. She caught him at the hospital's main entrance, one hand on his shoulder, the other reaching for the showbox. If they see those, people start asking questions. Dangerous questions. Questions that come with Pentagon lawyers and security briefings and people who decide you're a liability instead of an asset. You understand me? Once you open that box, you can't close it again. The elevator doors were ahead of them. Marcus was moving toward them with the terrifying certainty of someone who believed he was doing the right thing. "I don't care," he said. "I'm not letting them erase you again." The doors opened on the administrative floor. Laura's hand dropped. She'd spent 18 years learning when to fight and when to stand down, and in that moment, she understood that standing down was no longer an option. Not because she wanted to fight, but because her son was right. They were erasing her. They were rewriting her defense as violence, her loyalty as delusion, her existence as a security risk. The photograph in her cardboard box was proof that she'd been real once. The medals in Marcus's showbox were proof that she'd mattered. She followed him into the conference room where Dr. Pierce sat with 4 board members and the hospital administrator, all of them frozen mid-conversation at the sight of a teenager in army fatigues opening a showbox across their polished table. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, hammering against the windows like it was trying to get in. Marcus didn't knock. He pushed through the administrative wing doors with the kind of purposefulness that made the receptionist flinch, his army dress uniform pressed sharp enough to cut, a cardboard showbox held against his chest like it contained state secrets. The conference room was mid-sentence when he entered, for board members, the hospital administrator, and Dr. Pierce frozen mid-defense, their eyes tracking the uniform first, the teenager second, the box third. Laura stood near the window, her hands folded, her expression the same as it had been all morning, neutral as still water. Marcus crossed the room in 7 strides. His boots on the linoleum sounded like a countdown. He opened the showbox. Bronze Star. He set it on the conference table like he was placing ordnance. The medal caught the fluorescent light and threw it back, fractured and gold. Nobody moved. Marcus didn't breathe. Neither did the room. Purple Heart. Same placement. Precise. Military. The second Purple Heart landed beside the first, and Dr. Pierce's face cycled through 5 colors, red, then white, then gray, then back to red. He opened his mouth. Those medals proved nothing about her qualifications. "There's more," Marcus said. His voice was quiet. Younger than the uniform, older than his age. "There's always more." The commendation came out last, a formal citation printed on cream cardstock, edges crisp, words precise. Marcus laid it down and stepped back. The gesture was so military, so deliberate, that one of the board members actually sat back in his chair. Colonel Vance leaned forward. He was still weak, 3 weeks post-operative, surgical drains barely removed, the kind of pale that comes from blood loss and morphine, but his eyes snapped into focus like someone switching a laser sight. His voice came out in a whisper, but in the silence it traveled like a command radio. "Nighthawk 6. I'd know that voice anywhere." The room contracted around the words. Laura didn't turn. Didn't blink. But something shifted in her shoulders, the kind of infinitesimal movement that only people trained to read micro-expressions would catch. She was a captain in a nurse's uniform, and a retired colonel had just called her by her operational call sign in front of 7 witnesses. The Marine liaison from the VA, a woman with captain's bars and the kind of face that had seen too many flag-folded funerals, stood up slowly and reached for the commendation. Her eyes tracked across the text, and her jaw tightened the way it does when you're reading someone's service record and it's not what you expected. "It's more." She read aloud, "Captain Laura Bennett, for exceptional valor under fire during Operation Phantom Strike, distinguished herself by suppressing enemy combatants while performing field triage on 3 critically wounded personnel. Sustained a GSW to the left shoulder and continued operations for 47 minutes without evacuation. Coordinated extraction under fire. Saved 8 lives. Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. Bronze star with V device for Valor. The V device. For Valor in combat. You don't get that for being competent. You get it for being legendary. Dr. Pierce's voice climbed higher. This is irrelevant to her nursing license. She hid her background. She failed to disclose. The door behind them opened. A Navy general, visiting from Mercer Medical Center down the street, actually there for his granddaughter's pediatric admission, stepped into the conference room holding a cup of cooling coffee. He read the room in 3 seconds: medals, citation, the captain's bars on the VA liaison's uniform, the Marine in dress blues, and a retired colonel who'd just whispered something that made the temperature drop 8 degrees. He looked at Laura's face. He looked at the medals. His coffee cup hit the table. His hand came up to his forehead, and he executed a salute so sharp, so perfectly executed, that the sound of it cracked like a rifle shot. His hand was steady as a surgical laser, his eyes locked on Laura's with the kind of respect you only earn when you've walked through fire and carried people out on your back. Dr. Pierce stood up, red spreading up his neck like infection. With all due respect, sir, I don't know what you think you're. Sit down, the general said. Not loud. Not angry. Just command. The kind of voice that's been obeyed on 3 continents. You're done speaking. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended careers. The hospital administrator pulled out his phone with a kind of deliberate precision that meant he was already thinking about legal counsel. Within the hour, the Pentagon security review that had been quiet, bureaucratic, would become a flood. Dr. Pierce's surgical outcomes file, the one marked judgment calls, would be cross-referenced against his billing records. Infection rates modified on 3 separate occasions. A trauma surgeon named Mitchell, Army Major, dishonorably discharged 15 months ago after Dr. Pierce accused him of reckless endangerment when Mitchell tried to report Pierce's falsified data to hospital administration. One board member, the one who owed Pierce a favor, whose son had spent 60 days in a private rehab facility that Pierce had agreed to keep quiet about, would confess within the hour. He told me if I didn't vote for her termination, he'd make sure it came out. That my son's addiction issues would end up in the regional medical community database. The state nursing board complaint? Retracted by noon. The investigator got a single phone call from the Navy's Judge Advocate General. One conversation. That was all it took. 2 weeks later, Dr. Pierce stood in front of a classroom at Savannah Community College's continuing education wing, arranging a CPR dummy's arms into position for chest compressions. His nameplate was gone. His title was gone. What remained was a man in business casual, earning $18 an hour teaching basic life support to high school students who'd never heard his name. A girl in the second row raised her hand. Weren't you like a surgeon here? He didn't answer. Just adjusted the dummy's chin, making sure the airway stayed open. Muscle memory. That's all that was left. Meanwhile, Laura took the elevator to the 4th floor of Seattle General, not as a floor nurse anymore, but as director of emergency nursing. The administrator had offered her the position with a formal apology, full back pay, and a promotion that came with an office and windows and the authority to fix what Dr. Pierce had broken. She'd chosen emergency services without hesitation. That's where people need the most help, she'd said simply, and the administrator had nodded like he finally understood what he'd been missing all along. The framed unit patch hung on her office wall now, the same one that had lived sewn inside her jacket lining for 4 years, hidden, protected, waiting. Next to it, a photograph of Marcus in his dress uniform, newly commissioned as a second lieutenant with the 160th SAW, Night Stalkers. The same unit where his mother had earned her call sign. Colonel Vance visited 2 weeks after the hearing, still moving carefully, still on limited duty. He stood in her office and touched the frame gently, his eyes wet. "You saved my life at Bagram," he said quietly. "You saved it again here. And you never broke cover. Even when it cost you everything." Laura didn't answer. She was watching the emergency department floor below, where young nurses moved through the controlled chaos, where a patient was being admitted with a 3-vessel MI, where competence and grace intersected. "I did my job," she said finally. 6 months later, Laura moved through Seattle General's emergency department in scrubs the color of slate, coordinating a mass casualty response with the kind of calm that once cleared buildings in Bagram. A young nurse, someone who'd been in the break room during those early days of exile, froze during a trauma. Her hands trembled. Her breathing sped up. She looked like someone drowning in the deep end. Laura stepped beside her. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Breathe. You know this. Walk me through it." The nurse's hand steadied. She started working. Not perfectly, but with intention. With direction. Later, standing at the window overlooking the parking lot, Laura watched Dr. Pierce pull into the lot in a 12-year-old sedan, part of his monthly CPR recertification requirement, the settlement agreement that kept him out of prosecution. He parked. He saw her in the window above. He didn't wave. She didn't acknowledge him. Marcus visited in his 160th SAW flight suit, newly awarded his pilot's wings. He stood in her office and read the commendation photo on the wall, the one the hospital had released to local news, the one showing Captain Laura Bennett accepting the Bronze Star. "Colonel Vance says I remind him of you at my age," Marcus said, smiling that soft smile that belonged to the boy she'd raised and the soldiers she'd trained. "He's being kind," Laura said. They walked the hallway together, past the bulletin board where her disciplinary notice had once hung. Now it displayed her commendation photo and a formal hospital statement about values and integrity. About recognizing strength when it stands quietly in front of you. A resident approached, young, overwhelmed, carrying a chart like it was a gun he didn't know how to fire. "Director Bennett? I have a difficult family in Trauma 3. They're demanding a different doctor. I don't know how to." Laura listened. She always listened first. "Competence doesn't need to be loud," she said simply. "Do the work. Earn the trust. The rest follows." The resident nodded. He understood now what Dr. Pierce had never grasped, that power isn't negotiated with networking calls. It's earned one moment at a time, one person at a time, one saved life at a time. As she returned to her office, Laura touched the framed unit patch, the same fabric that had lived hidden in her jacket lining for 4 years. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She performed her rounds an hour later, checking Colonel Vance's progress as he visited a veteran patient downstairs, both of them the kind of men and women who understood what it cost to wear the uniform twice. Laura's presence commanded respect not through volume but through the unshakable confidence of someone who'd proven herself in the places that matter most. She looked directly at the camera, her eyes steady, her voice quiet as always, but with the weight of Bagram behind every syllable. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Then she walked back into a trauma bay where a young nurse waited for direction, where someone's life balanced on the edge of a decision, where Captain Laura Bennett, the quietest legend Seattle General had ever known, went back to work. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the ones who earn their respect in silence. Comment below, what would you have done in Laura's position? And let me know if you think Dr. Pierce's punishment was enough. Thanks for watching.